Special meeting for the planning commission December 21st, 2022. Ryan, would you like to move call for roll call?
Will do, Mr. Chair. Bazarak.
Here.
Lachey.
Present.
All right. Anderson. Gardner.
Here.
Gaunt.
I'll be accident today, by the way. She fall and had some bleeding from her head. She's okay. She didn't go to the hospital. Just had an MRI. She's not on notice and they don't play the plan, but she won't tell me she's okay, and she will be outside to forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. Broker.
Yeah.
And Chairmans. All right, you have a quorum, Mr. Chair.
The next item is for the approval of the agenda, but before we do the approval of the agenda, there will be correspondence put out today late in the afternoon related to one of the agenda items, the other new business. Because I want to make sure that those who may be in the room or those who are joining us via Zoom, which everyone is supposed to all in planning commission meeting, is aware as to what item C will relate to. So the email.
The audio is garbled. Sorry to interrupt. The audio is garbled. I just
can everyone hear? The email that went out late this afternoon, in case you did not have an opportunity to see it, I was reading the report. City of Scotland has been made aware that Airbnb has sent an email directly to a number of the short-term rental hosts in the city, informing them the planning commission will be discussing potential regulations in the city for short-term rentals. The city thanks the Airbnb team for the additional communication on top of what the city has already. We clear that the planning commission is not taking any action on short-term rental regulations. I am clear the planning commission did confirm the discussion tonight on short-term rentals is only to begin a conversation for creating a framework and a timeline around the consideration for any potential and the reason for this is that during the enduring community survey, the number one item on the community survey for the city council to address in 2023 was short-term rental. However, the short-term rental discussion, we just need to kind of frame as to the importance of it and how we will approach it. And that's what we're going to do together tonight. Kind of framework on how is the best way to approach it that would involve the entire community and making certain that all of us get occur. So again, tonight there will be no discussion on short-term rental other than the need for how we would build a framework for approaching this topic in 2023. But when public comment is open, and we will make comments, but it will not have anything to do with tonight's actual discussion of new regulations. With that, I'd like to have the approval of tonight's agenda. So we'll make a motion. All those in favor? Yes. Opposed? No. Motion carries. The approval of minutes or voting on minutes is a continuation of last week's meeting on December 15th. Therefore, that would move us into the public comment part of the agenda. Anyone that would like to speak related to any of the items that are on the agenda is welcome to do so by either pointing to the microphone or raising your hand online. Limit your conversation to 3 minutes at the start of the conversation. Please introduce yourself, tell us where you live, and then the comments start.
Mr. Chair, I'm getting some text messages from folks that are uncommonly saying that some is they're unable to understand when we talk. That two of the connections I want to ensure.
Mr. Chair, I think our city attorney is trying to speak, if he wants to say something too. So I'm not really sure what's going on with the audio here.
Mr. Patterson.
Oh,
Yeah,
there
I'm
you go.
assuming that you can hear us. I think I can hear Ryan Cummings fine, but when the discussion is towards the front of the room by the PC chair, it comes with like an echo in the Zoom room, and it's hard to make out.
Yeah, we can understand a word.
Can you hear me, Chris?
I can hear you. You're a little bit. You're not faint, or you're faint, but you're not garbled. But the PC chair is sort of garbled. So the initial conversation leading into asking for public comment, I think you were talking about short-term rentals, but it was somewhat difficult to discern for purposes of Zoom.
Yeah, we have no idea what they said.
And you still cannot hear what we're saying currently.
What?
All right.
That's my concern.
Mr. Patterson, if you could let us know if this other mic works a little better for the chair.
Would this microphone be better?
Yeah, you definitely are easier to hear. We may get still a little bit of echo, but whatever's going on with Ryan's is sort of perfect. Like that clearly mics into this room.
Over.
Chris, can you hear from my microphone?
Yes, we can hear that.
Okay.
Okay, I think the chair's going to move to a different seat. We'll try a different microphone setup, and hopefully that'll help.
Why don't they use his? It's perfect.
Here we go.
Perhaps, Mr. Chair, if you would be so inclined, perhaps it'd be good to maybe read your statement again, so folks had a chance to maybe hear what you had to say.
Chris, it's already on the line. Can you tell me, are you hearing this okay?
Yeah, I can hear you better. Unlike Ryan's discussion, it's like you still have a little bit of echo when you talk, but definitely you're louder. So I think maybe we'll be able to make it out.
Well, I'm not certain, as to what's happening versus in the past, but if this is clearer, then hopefully people would be able to hear it. We did the roll call and the approval of the agenda. But before we move forward, I just wanted to address one of the items that was on the agenda, which is under new business item 3, the short-term rental discussion to build a tentative schedule, calendar planning, and objectives. I think the city put out an email late in the day, and many people might not have had the opportunity to see this email. So I want to take an opportunity here before we open up public comments to read the email and confirm what it is saying. So the email that came out today, late afternoon, stating the city of Somerset has been made aware that the Airbnb team has sent an email directed to a number of short-term rental hosts in the city, informing them the planning commission will be discussing potential regulations in the city for short-term rentals. The city thanks the Airbnb team for their additional communication on top of what the city has already publicly noticed. To be clear, the planning commission is not taking any action on short-term rental regulations this evening. On the chair, myself, on behalf of the planning commission, confirmed that the discussion topic for short-term rental is to begin a conversation for creating a framework and a timeline for considerations of additional regulations as state and local laws will allow. No decisions will be made at this evening's meeting. So that was put out, and I just confirmed for them, and for those who are already in the room, that the reason why this is even on our agenda was that it was the #1 topic that the community, in the community survey done at the end of the year, council, they would like to see them addressed in 2023. So we have it on the agenda just to kind of create a framework for how best to do that.
knowing that it would need to involve the entire community and voices from the entire community. So tonight, when we get to that part of the agenda, all we will be doing is discussing a framework for how best to approach this and a tentative timeline for what we'd like to see as we try to start to move forward on just a discussion on fact gathering and information gathering before you move forward. So for anyone who is online who thought that we were going to have any type of conversation in regards to short-term rental or regulations or changes there too, that will not be occurring this evening. Obviously, we welcome everyone to remain, and participate in any of the planning commission meetings, like any of the meetings within the city of Saugatuck. So at this time, we will go ahead and open for public comments, anything that's on the agenda, but I would ask that if you have comments in regards to the short-term rental, that you limit it to something as to whether or not it's appropriate for the commission to move forward with it, or something that has to do with the framework for how we may be looking at this, and not actually anything that has to do with the regulations. Would anyone like to open up or first speak? And again, if you'd like to speak, limit it to 3 minutes. And when you begin, give us your name and your address. Do we have anyone? You see anyone? Right?
Yeah, and if anybody's on the Zoom call and would like to speak, you're going to want to raise your kind of virtual hand to do that. All right, Mr. Chair, there's no one in the room and no one online that's raised their hand with a desire to speak.
Very good. Then we will close the public comment portion. Next, we have old business. Having none, this is carried over from the meeting. I'd like to move on to new business. The first item in the new business, which was a carryover from the December 15 meeting, was the site plan for a home to be built at 383 Dunegrass Circle. Before I give any of my comments, Ryan, would you like to be the one to kind of catch us up on your updated memo?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. So at the last Planning Commission meeting, Planning Commission tabled this particular site plan review with a request to city staff to review the prior homes that had been approved in this PUD overlay area to kind of evaluate what heights they were at, what height they were approved at. So good thing is we had plans for all of them, good digital copies of plans on all of them except for one. So our planning consultant dug into these and just kind of want to summarize his findings. All of this has been updated in the overall kind of memo to the Planning Commission, so that way we kind of kept everything in one spot. The Planning Commission specifically asked us to take a look at the average grade calculation and whether or not maybe perhaps that had been used in prior evaluations. The challenge with that is that the average grade wasn't either indicated or decipherable on most of the plans, but our planning consultant's opinion is that all 7 of the prior approved plans do appear or do appear that they would have met the zoning ordinance standard. As you know, the PUD has a specific note and different way of measuring heights. And so we took a look at compliance in that regard as well. And what we found was that 6 out of the 7 prior approved homes did meet the PUD requirement for height when you measured from lowest fire department vehicle access up to 30 feet. There's one home that did not, that was 389 Dunegrass. All the others actually had pitched roofs. The only one that didn't have a pitched roof was 389 Dunegrass. It's a flat roof, which is similar to this circumstance. That did exceed the PUD requirement. Essentially, when we looked at it, there was a drive kind of going up to the home that a car could access, but when we evaluated whether or not that was the highest fire department vehicle access location, didn't feel that was going to meet that standard. So had a fire truck been able to go up that other drive, it would have met the PUD height requirement. In that particular case, they actually had built kind of a fire truck access. And when you measure from that actual access location and go up from there, it did exceed the PUD height standard. Zoning standard in that particular case would have been met. Planning consultant kind of provided a little bit of feedback on kind of some flat roof analysis. In this particular case, as I noted, the PUD requirements or language is kind of what's the standard that at least from staff perspective is the standard to use in measuring height in this particular overlay area. As a side note, the zoning ordinance standard for height in this particular case wouldn't be met either. It would be over 28 feet. It would be at about 29 feet, 3 inches. If you were to use this, the average grade calculation, the zoning ordinance. So really in this particular case, we would have been over the zoning ordinance standard as well as the PUD standard, depending on if you were to measure it either way. So with that, I think we've provided you hopefully with what you were looking for, and happy to answer any additional questions you may have.
Thank you, Ryan. Before I open with my comments to the commission, would the applicant like to address us with any additional things in addition to what we had from last week's meeting?
I just want to start off by saying thank you for all being here. I know it's a busy time of year to come back in such short notice, but during the last meeting, we established clear precedents for potential violations for max lot coverage within dune grass. We tabled the conversation to verify if the same can be determined for the building heights, which we now have conclusive evidence of at least one violation. I can now state the following objectively. We are proposing a design which meets the standards of the current buildings within dune grass. We are proposing a design that fits safely within the scale of a residential community and will be one of the smallest buildings within the PUD. We are proposing a design that is environmentally sensitive and has already been approved by Eagle. We are proposing a design that is consistent with what the PUD wants built and has already been approved. We are proposing a design that does not create any potential life safety issues and has been given written approval from the fire department to support this. Based on the recommendations of the zoning administrator in today's meeting document, the Planning Commission can amend or supplement the conditions of both lot coverage and building height for buildings within the PUD. This is not dependent on changing the language of the PUD, nor is it an issue for the Zoning Board of Appeals. You can make this determination. Before you do that, we ask you to please consider the facts that I just listed, but also to consider where we are at in this process and how we got here, which is under the guidance of the city. Thank you.
Thank you. We do appreciate it.
Mr. Chair, if I could, Mr. Harmoning that's on the Zoom call is one of the owners for this particular property. I know you allowed the other owner to speak at the last meeting. I'm not sure if you're okay with him commenting or not.
That would be fine. If you keep it short, please, Ed.
Yeah, of course. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
The first thing I want to do is thank the board very much for addressing our project. My wife and I are in an incredibly sensitive position regarding our future, and we respectfully ask for your help. But I want to go back to the thank you. We really, Melissa, you met at the last meeting, and I are so grateful for all that you've done in terms of looking at our project. I wrote some comments, but I would be restating what Joe said, our architect, so eloquently. We really have tried to be respectful of the process and respectful with regard to the city. When we hired a licensed architect, we worked with the building administrator. We went step by step with the city. And I want to say one other thing. We're now in this position where we spent 2 years planning to build this house. This is not a vacation home for us. This is where we would like to retire. We want to join the community, and we're trying to do it in a respectful way. I'm sitting at a dining room table where I watched my wife painstakingly go through the drawings where she would put a couch for Christmas, where she would have the dining room table to have enough people to celebrate together. We feel like we did it right. It wasn't one of these where we built a structure and later on you all felt like, hey, wait a second, these people did not come to the city or the building department to ask permission to do this. We felt like we did it right, where we asked permission first, worked with the city step by step, and we're seeking to build a safe structure consistent with the other properties in Dunegrass. I would note that the homeowners association, and that would be the area that probably would be most impacted by our house, has approved our building plan. We want to be neighbors and we look forward to being your neighbors. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ed, and we do appreciate your situation. Before we open it up to the overall commission members, I just wanted to kind of summarize some of the things that I have learned myself since our meeting last Thursday. First of all, I want to thank Ryan, the plan consultants, Chris, on the legal team, for the insights and expertise in regarding the site plan and the PUD overlay that was put into place back in 2014, 2015. I also want to recognize and thank all my fellow commissioners, because I can tell you that we have spent many hours this week studying the PUD, the prior approvals that have been granted, community correspondence, and really trying to understand what our authoritative right of this commission is, all to arrive at what we believe is right as well as a legal conclusion. So thanks to all of you. I really do mean that. And on behalf of the applicant, as we have said, we understand and we feel for your situation too. One of the first points I would like to address is whether or not the city administrator and us as a planning commission have the right to administratively approve a plan that may not appear to comply in all areas as laid out in the zoning or the PUD. After reviewing the CRC zoning and the PUD overlay documents, I believe that the purpose of the PUD, and it's the part that we talk about where we need to strictly comply, relates to the section of 154.110, item C. The intent and purpose of the PUD is to have the permanent preservation of open spaces, natural resources, and the existing small town rural character of Saugatuck. It listed those as the major objectives of the PUD. The use of the word major here helped me to kind of understand that that's really the issue that they might have been referring to when it comes to the strict compliance in this preservation. The area of minor changes, are they allowed, is addressed in section 154.066, item B, that talks about minor changes. And it says a minor amendment may be approved by the zoning administrator if, and it goes on to talk about if it's in regards to, would it have changed the overall issue of the PUD? And anyone can kind of read the three. It's a proposed change will not affect the basis on which the initial approval was granted. The proposed minor change will not adversely affect the overall plan community. The proposed change will not affect the character or the intensity of the use or the general configuration of the buildings or uses of the site. That same type of authoritative approval is granted to the Planning Commission in section 154.117 underneath the same number B with the same 1, 2, and 3s. So as far as our conversation during the week of do we have the authority to do so, I believe the answer there is yes. And that would also apply then to the city administrator today as well as in the past. Now, regarding the requirements listed for discussion here tonight and has already been raised, the lot coverage and height. First, I say let's take a look at the lot coverage. Lot coverage ratios, as when we went back over the prior approvals, I noticed that the lot coverage ratios at the time when the Planning Commission looked at the very first proposal on Dunegrass lot number 21, which was 395 Dunegrass, which had a lot coverage ratio in excess of the 5%. It was not even a discussion item during that Planning Commission meeting. And which led me to really want to go back and try to understand how could that be. So I went back and was looking closely at the PUD general notes, and I saw that item 2 listed average lot size of 1.6 acres. Thinking this through, it seemed only reasonable that a development such as Dunegrass would not develop a grouping of smaller lots that would have them subject to a 5% legal lot coverage. So it seemed reasonable they added a note stipulating that the average lot size that to be used for this PUD would be 1.6 acres. Given this, I wondered if the 1.6 acre number was what was being used in that first proposal, as well as the subsequent 6 approved by the city administrator. As it would help us explain how all 7 properties, the majority of which exceeded the 5% of their legal lot coverage, but yet it was not an issue for approval. During the week, I did reach out to the prior city administrator, as well as members of the planning, a few members of the planning commission for the 2015. And they have each told me that the 1.6 acre average is what they have been using to determine the 5% lot coverage number. And that it is allowed within the PUD, minor, if you want to say the minor change, but that is how the PUD was originally constructed. And that 1.6 applies only to the 14 homes that are within the actual PUD and not the ones that were outside of it that are just part of the special land use and are subject to the CRC. So therefore, I would believe that the lot coverage for 383 Dune Grass would be compliant if we were applying the same standards as we have done with the original property built that was approved by the city administrator and the planning commission, as well as the majority of the subsequent 6 that had exceeded the 5% of their legal lot limit. Next, though, we will look at the height, where the PUD specifically lists the requirements in the height underneath the item C to be the 30 feet maximum from where the fire truck would park, which is presumably would be the driveway. In my discussions with the prior administrator and prior PC members, I came to understand they held all site plans to complying with this PUD 30-foot limit, or they could comply with the CRC limit, which was the 28 feet if you used an average of the ground level elevation. And from what Ryan was just discussing, I believe that is true, that all of them have met that standard, either the 30-foot using the lowest point for the truck, or the average elevation of 28. And many of them we have found did have to make modifications to their site plans to receive that approval or to meet one of those 2 standards. So in my opinion, when I look at the prior history where we did require modifications to a site plan to meet either the CRC 28 feet or the PUD 30-foot limit on height, it would be maybe outside of what we would consider minor for approving the height variance of the current proposal. So I ask you to consider these points and the overall purpose of the special land use and the PUD. The direct authority to the city. Sorry about that. I'd like for us to consider approving this proposed plan subject to the site plan being modified to meet either the 28-foot limit of the CRC or the 30-foot limit that is within the PUD here this evening, but provide the authority to sign off on that modification to the city administrator, Ryan Cummins. If that type of approval could be reached here this evening, it at least would provide the applicant with a more timely way to be able to satisfy the requirements where they wouldn't have to wait for our monthly meetings to occur of the planning commission, and would not have to come back in front of the planning commission if they made that. That is kind of where I stand, and I'd like to open the floor now up to other members who can kind of give us any of their opinions of what they have seen or believe. Thank you.
I just want to mention good work in the 5-day turnaround to get all the information together and present it. I'm in lockstep with you, Steve. I like the option of giving the authorization, approving it with the able to make the modifications quickly.
Others.
I guess one immediate thought I have is it may be worth hearing from Chris, since we have him on the line. I know our chairman just mentioned some legal arguments, and I think it would be helpful to hear from Chris with thoughts on some of those points.
Yeah, if can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Chris.
Okay, thank you. And I want to apologize at first for not being there in person. I did contact the city early, and I think I might have caught a bug last weekend, so I didn't want to ruin anybody else's Christmas holiday. So I apologize for being here remotely. But I did hear most of what the chair had to say, and I do appreciate all the background work. I think it's consistent with the background work, at least that was performed in the supplement memo. At the bottom of the supplement memo, although there were references made to the PUD provisions specifically, I think 117 as it references the ability to look at minor amendments, although I don't know that that's being relied upon in the chair's discussion, but the ultimate recommendation that was discussed is consistent with the end of the supplemental memo, where we did put the site plan provisions related to looking at conditions. And so that authority provides a list of what exactly would be consistent for a condition that could be provided, what would be the standard that you could impose such a condition, and then that actually is authorized. So, I mean, I guess to sum it up, yes, you can approve it with conditions. The city code itself provides some standards as to what those conditions have to satisfy. One of them, particularly the intent, is that any condition you impose is to sort of ensure that the approval that you're giving is consistent with the PUD compliance. So if you're imposing a condition to ensure that the height complies with the PUD, I think that's consistent with what you'll see as the last page of the copied sections that are in your supplemental memorandum.
Yes, it is.
Chris, Russ Gardner, thanks for being here this evening. I've had a few discussions with Chairman Mans as well as a couple of other planning commissioners, and the question that was just asked is I'm also curious to make sure that I'm clear. We are not in a position to be able to provide variances to the PUD or to the zoning code. That's not our responsibility. So I want to be very careful that whatever we come up with in terms of a solution here does not overstep the boundaries of a planning commission from a legal standpoint. The also understanding of a PUD, and I've become far more familiar with PUD since our last discussion. Absolutely. Is, you know, and you spoke to the intent. And my understanding of a PUD is that the intent is to overlay the zoning code, but allow some flexibility for the zoning administrator and the people that are coming to us with site plans to have some flexibility, because the intent here is to provide a place in which the natural beauty of the area and so forth is maintained to the best of the ability of the zoning administrator and the applicants, but allowing some flexibility. But there's some hard lines in the sand on this: the height, the lot coverage, which at first I didn't understand, but now I have a better understanding, is that 1.6 acres has been used as the basis for lot coverage. The height has been a line in the sand, as has been mentioned. So, Chris, my question to you is, as a planning commissioner, what really is our authority here to able to, I don't know, modify, I don't even know what the right word is. It's not approve a zoning variance, but what is exactly is our responsibility and authority to be able to accommodate some of this, if that question makes sense?
It does. And I think hopefully if I heard most of what the PC chair said, I think I'm going to try to answer it in relation to the introduction that he provided with respect to reading the documents. I don't think it was suggested that it was a variance nor an amendment. I think in reference to 154117, which does provide for minor changes, I think the reference was that as it relates to the roof height, that would probably even be in excess of what would be within the scope of the minor changes in subsection B or C in 117. So I think the analysis is that based on how the original PUD site plan was approved, in looking at the notes, you actually have a lot coverage standard that was provided by the city as being applied by the Planning Commission this evening, that allows you to rely on the 5% lot coverage related to that averaging of the parcels, which would indicate that the building envelope is consistent. So you're not offering a variance, you're not modifying the PUD, the introductory information and the background information would indicate that the lot coverage is compliant because of the flexibility that the city council is approved as how you guys are reading and applying the documents. And then as to height, I think if I heard the latter section, the construction there is sort of twofold, which is really taking a position that the documents do not evidence the ability to approve the height as currently proposed by the applicant. The height as was submitted in the administrator's report does exceed that note that's in the PUD site plan, and it's otherwise not consistent with the prior approvals of the prior decisions, including especially the decision that occurred by the Planning Commission, just sort of the one that's most contemporaneous with the city's approval of the project. And so consistent with that, I think what was proposed was the discussion of a condition. And the condition, you do have the right to approve. Of course, you have the right to deny it if you think it doesn't meet the standards of the PUD, but you can approve also with conditions. And the conditions are those conditions that you're essentially using your reasonable judgment to impose to ensure that it does otherwise comply with the standard. And so really the condition that was provided was we would approve it subject to them lowering the building height or redesigning it so that it complies with the PUD approval, the note that was provided there. As far as the reference as to averaging, sort of looking at the building height in an alternative, I think you'd have to look at the supplemental memo and decide if those approvals really do develop whether you can do the averaging or the note that's provided, the 30 feet. So that's really a discussion as to whether you would impose that as part of the condition. But it sounds like you have a couple options there. You would either do the alternative, saying they're going to meet one or the other, or meet one probably being the note that's provided in the PUD site plan. But I agree with you, Russ, that you do not, as a planning commission, have the ability to vary the PUD. I don't think that you can amend the PUD decision as is provided in the code. Although there's flexibility in the original PUD decision that was made, it does indicate that any amendments have to go through the same process that was provided for the original approval, which is not how this has been noticed or how it's been presented to the Planning Commission. So I think as the PC chair adequately sort of, and rather with which much detail sort of went through the documents telling you what from that perspective the approval documents provide. And if you find that it's consistent with the approval documents, you have the ability to do that conditional approval requiring the applicant to reduce the height consistent with the prior PUD.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
I have a question. So the 1.6 acres is the lot size. Where is that documented? So it's in the we got a week ago, indicated they would need. Yeah, but
so in the general notes to the PUD, item 2 has the proposed single family residential PUD. And it addresses the fact that it relates to lots 1 through 5 and 13 through 21. And there it lists the average lot area of 1.6 acres. Whereas you would see above, the original CRC had a minimum lot size of 2 acres. So when they highlighted the 1.6, the intention from everyone, from the city administrator, where they were administering, as well as the original planning commission, said that that was included as it would be the basis for all 14 lots when you were considering the coverage ratio of the 5% from the original CRC.
So what is the context? So average means, we take whatever sizes and you get to 1. It doesn't mean, to me, it doesn't say, well, this is the lot size standard.
It does not, except the only thing that kind of goes back to what I would say, and when I'm reviewing it, is the kind of the reasonable man and why was it put in there. And I believe that when you have a development of 14 homes within a private community, an exclusive community, and you have lot sizes that are being made available that are anywhere from 0.4 up to 3 acres or greater, that they had made the determination that the 1.6 would be the average, and therefore it was noted in there, and that's what has been used consistently for lot coverage ratio.
Yeah, and I just did the math. So if you take the general notes and if you take the total PUD land area of 32.9 acres and subtract the open space of 9.8, divide that by
The 14.
the 1.6, you get 14.43 lots. So it's
Right.
approximate, is rounding basically.
Right.
But that's where that number
Okay.
comes
Okay.
from.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
So again, I didn't understand that 1.6. You and I have had several conversations. At first, we're kind of scratching our heads and now.
But because I think that all of us, I tried to really understand what had occurred in the past, knowing that, there's various opinions maybe out in the community about how things have been approved or whether they were approved within the standards. I believe that the city is always trying to act on and comply with all the ordinance and regulations. And so therefore I was trying to determine, how did we have 7 homes approved, of which the majority were larger than the 5%? And that's when I noticed that and then was able to track that down and see that really was what
including the very first one, which went through the commission, went through all of that.
Correct,
That's
exactly, the very first
exactly how
one.
I got there as well.
So
But then
largest lot, smallest lot, we assume it's 1.6.
using 1.6.
Okay.
And also knowing that, that as Joe had mentioned, or I think it was Ed, the association, of course, will look at every one of them also, and they have their own board. But as far as how the planning commission or the administrator does the approval, historically it has been utilized that 1.6, and that's why the 1.6 was listed as the average.
I have another question for Chris, along these lines. So the recommended, motion that we may consider on page 9 of the packet is to adopt or approve the site plan with some conditions, one of which is updating the plan to comply with the 5% lot coverage requirement. So does that in effect mean that the zoning, if we adopted that, if we took this approach, we would then defer to our zoning administrator to administer the PUD accordingly?
Well, and I believe that you wouldn't need to have that as a condition, because what we've now determined since this was put together is that with the 1.6, they do not exceed the 5%.
Well, then I guess the follow-up question is, are we wed to the one for Chris is, are we wed to that 1.6 analysis that Cindy Osmond appears to have adopted for the 5% lot coverage analysis?
Well, let me back up first to the first question. It's not my supplemental memo, but in working with the city, I think the goal that we tried to provide in the recommendation is so that the planning commission, I think it's always difficult with listening sort of in the last meeting, trying to figure out how can we most provide practical advice to the planning commission and giving some options on how to move forward. So I don't think that the list of conditions 1 through 5 were meant to be provided as a sole recommendation. There's language in there saying that you can kind of amend or take those as you see fit. So I do want to indicate, and I can't speak for the people, I know Ryan can speak at least a part of that, but I think the goal was we wanted to give you some options as to how you could sort of take a decision and decide to move forward. So with the chair's comment, I agree. I don't think that number 1 has to be taken with 2 through 5. And I know that question was already answered, but do want to at least address that. As to the second part, I don't think that you're beholden to a zoning administrator's interpretation, because I think the approval and the resolution is subject to both the zoning administrator and the planning commission. I think the important part that you're hearing about is the way that the planning commission would have applied it contemporaneously with the original approvals of the PUD, and that the zoning administrator is speaking to the details that were in the PUD approval that allowed the planning commission to reach that resolution. So I think it's just factual information that speaks to what supported the decision that was made at the time the PUD was approved, and then the actual site plan that was both approved by the zoning administrator and the planning commission shortly thereafter.
Correct.
Mr. Chair, yeah, I've got a couple comments. First, I want to say that I'm a firm believer in the strict construction and application of our ordinances, especially when it comes to zoning, that they were carefully put in place. They are designed to preserve the character and specialness of any city, but including Saugatuck in this particular instance. I also want to reference again, as I did in the last meeting, the purposes of the Planning Commission under our bylaws. Article 3, I won't read them again. But I try to keep those in mind as I decide how to proceed with this in my own membership and eventual vote, I assume. I'm also looking at administering the PUD, which I think is our purpose here. The administration of the PUD, I think, should include the intent of its original drafters. One of the intents of the drafters was to develop parcels. There's plenty of open space in this PUD, and the intent of the drafters of the PUD was that the parcels delineated, including parcel 19, were to be developed, not left empty. In that regard, I think strict construction of the PUD in administration is not following its drafter's intent. I also further think that the petitioner with their current site plan not only furthers the purposes of the PUD, the purposes of the dune grass development, the purposes of the city of Saugatuck, I would be in favor of any motion that would give the zoning administrator the ability to follow up with respect to both the lot coverage issue and the height. Of course, height is more problematic. And I think it is, last meeting, we talked about changing the footprint, adding another driveway and what that might involve with Eagle or otherwise. I think there are other ways for this particular building to exist that complies with one or the other of the acceptable height requirements. So I look forward to, hopefully look forward to the Hammerings joining our community.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Anyone else if not, do we have a motion from the floor?
Mr. Chair, I move that the submitted site plan by the Hammerings be approved with the following conditions: that the requirements as stated following will be reviewed and approved by our zoning administrator, to update the site plan to comply with the 5% lot coverage requirement, update the building plan to comply with PUD height requirements, provide a landscaping plan in accordance with section 154.027 and site restoration per resolution number 150610-A, secure fire department approval of access and sprinkling system, and finally secure Eagle critical dune permitting requirements as applicable.
Mark, before we ask for a second.
Excuse me?
Before I ask for a second.
Oh, sorry.
Can I ask for the reason for number 1 to stay in, since we have determined at 1.6 they do meet the 5%?
That was understood in my motion.
Oh, I just thought that we wouldn't include it then. It wouldn't be subject to that. But okay.
It would be subject to the 1.6 average lot size requirement.
Right, which that's already met.
Requirement, the 1.6 average lot size as determined in the general notes of the PUD.
Right, which means that number 1 wouldn't really be a necessary condition.
Well, I guess I'm a little unclear. I maybe I haven't followed the discussion and some of Chris's points. I didn't think that was kind of 100% determined, but it's not obvious to me when I read it. I know that's what Cindy interpreted it as, but I guess what I heard from Chris was that we're not wed to that, so there seemed to be some wiggle room, I thought, but yeah.
We have a motion that we can leave it in.
My understanding in making my motion was that if you took the 1.6, this as the average, that and the intent of the drafters as expressed in the general notes of the PUD, that this lot complied with the 5%.
Correct, which then in the motion, it wouldn't be necessary. In motion would be conditioned upon the things that they're not in compliance with, but.
Oh. Okay, strike my first condition.
Which is what Chris said earlier, is that we wouldn't have a necessity to have a condition for number one. But I'm just wondering. We can leave it in there, then Ryan can.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you for that.
So Mr. Lachey, you struck number one from your motion.
Correct. I can
But the rest
restate
remain.
it. if you like it.
The motion on the table is for the approval of the site plan with the condition that they update the building plan to comply with the PDU height requirements, provide a landscaping plan in accordance with section 154.027 and the site restoration plan resolution 150.610A, that is secure the fire department approval for access and sprinkler systems and secure Eagle critical dome permitting requirements. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
We do have a second. I think we should have roll call.
Well, Mr. Chair, you do have a
Chair.
motion on the table that you can have
Robert, you
discussion on.
Discussion, please.
Yep.
Oh, I'm sorry. Discussion upon the motion. My apologies.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that I am still, I guess I just don't feel like I personally have closed the loop on the 5% lot coverage issue, so I would vote. Right at the moment, I want to hear what other people have to say and discuss it, but at the moment, I'm not 100% comfortable removing that condition. When I look at the general notes, just from a common sense perspective, the average lot area 1.6 acres seems to speak to the fact that the minimum lot area in the CRC district is 2 acres. So it's speaking to the fact that it's a smaller lot than the zoning requirement would allow for. It seems pretty clear that we're talking about 5% lot coverage of the lot itself. And I know that Cindy Osmond did not agree with that, but I guess what I heard from Chris was that we're not wed to that. So in my mind, I guess I just don't feel like we've come to a conclusion on that, and I would not be comfortable, at least at this point. Again, I'd like to hear other thoughts, but excluding that.
But the one thought I would say, and at least I was kind of referenced, I think it's in reference here several times, is that this is the standard that was used on the very first approval for 395 dune grass. And it's also the standards that's been utilized for each of the ones subsequent where they exceeded. So where you first looked, you would say it exceeded to 5% of the legal lot dimension, but it was within the 5% of the 1.6, and all 7 of those have been approved. So you're being very consistent with the way that it's been done historically, as well as the intention of the PUD, and keeping to the desire to keep it a small community with the natural resources in place. But that's how I see it.
Yeah, it's again, as I mentioned, I struggled at first with this because the actual lot size is 0.43 acres. And that's the actual physical lot size. But from a consideration from a PUD review standpoint, that 1.6 acres, as has just been stated, has been used as the measurement for lot coverage for the proposals that have been approved. Using that 1.6 acres, this particular development or this particular site plan is well below the 5% for 1.6 acres. Or not well below, but it's below it's below the 5%. So in my mind, using that standard, it's in compliance. And I would even suggest that maybe if it's appropriate, is that the motion includes reference back to this, because my concern is going forward is there's going to be other site plans, at least 3 coming forward. And I want to make sure there's clarity that we haven't overstepped our boundaries. And number 2 is that the zoning administrator has an understanding of how to apply this to future site plans. So I'm in general support of the motion, but I would suggest that we maybe for clarity, maybe include this in that motion, just to be sure that there's no confusion for both the applicant as well as planning and future planning commissioners.
Do you have a suggestion for the amendment to the motion?
If no one is opposed, what I would suggest is that the site plan does comply with the 5% lot coverage requirement as measured against the 1.6 average lot area, as noted in the general notes of the PUD.
I believe under Robert's rules, that is a friendly amendment, which has to be approved by the maker and the second. I would accept that amendment.
Agreed.
Thank you for the point of order. Appreciate it.
A comment I have maybe to you, Ann, is that I'm gonna see if I heard Chris right a second time. We have, as authority, as a planning commission, a fresh and new and individual right to approve or deny each and every site plan that comes before us. But I do believe that we have to be cognizant. We are not bound by what a zoning administrator did, because we can go our own way. We can follow what somebody else has done. I think that there is actual precedent versus technical precedent. I think the prior zoning administrator's consistent practice, as well as the first lot that was developed and was approved by the planning commission, sets what I would call actual precedent. And there is weight to that. And that weighs heavily on my decision in that regard. So yes, what he said, I believe, is correct in terms of we are not bound by any of the prior decisions that were made either by the zoning administrator or the planning commission. But those have some impact on, at least in my mind, as to how we should proceed.
Any other comments related to the motion on the table
And the amendment.
and the amendment or the motion as amended?
There you go.
If
A quick question for Ryan. Do you happen to know, and this is kind of an unfair question off the cuff, but the lot size of the first 7 lots that
it would be, that would have been in the photos also in last week's. So in the drawing, I don't know if we don't have like the, like last week, if you put this packet, it actually highlights the 5 of the 7 that were larger. So the answer to that was lot 15 was 0.6 acres.
Yeah, I didn't.
Lot 16 was 0.8 acres. Lot 17 was 0.5 acres. Lot 21 was 0.6 acres and lot 20 was 0.8 acres.
Okay.
And I believe that the coverage ratios, and Ryan, you could support this, if we were looking at each of them individually based upon the size of their legal lots, they would range from.
I'd recommend, we've got a lot of different side conversations here.
Give me a second. I believe, Ryan, you could support that the lot coverage average varied from 1 that came in at the 5, but 7.2 up to 14% on one of the sites. But once you applied the 1.6, they were all in compliance.
So that was 0.8.
Yeah, I will just say that I just kind of wrap up my thoughts. I appreciate everyone's thoughts and the point on precedent, but I just, from my personal common sense perspective, coming into this meeting, this being the first time I've thought about this 1.6 average idea. I hadn't thought about it before, but my reaction just quickly looking through the general notes is it just doesn't make sense to me. But that's just my personal opinion.
Yeah, I agree. It's just, it seems, with the original recommendation we got a week ago that it didn't conform with the PUD. So where in the PUD does that note appear?
The general notes page that
The general notes page.
It's really hard to see. It's so small. You really have to blow it up.
And I can pull it up.
I got a blown up copy. Hang on.
Today, yeah.
In fact, I didn't even realize the notes were on.
You're the guy originally.
You're talking about this guy, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you really have to kind of blow it up and see.
Right. Yes.
So it's.
No, I saw that there, but what's the context? Like where?
It's on the actual.
Right there.
Oh, that, okay.
Map.
That's what's blown up.
Yep.
Got it. Okay, so this is, okay.
So in my mind, it's necessarily incorporated into the PUD because it is part of the diagram.
Okay.
It's up to you. That's up to you.
would be helpful.
So for the audience's benefit, we have a general notes, which is actually up on the page there, and we're referencing where it is on the PUD. It's actually about that size in the PUD, so it's not easily read.
Right.
So it was extracted by the zoning administrator for our review. So that's the question.
Sticking point is, again, my personal opinion is that I look at this, I see average lot area 1.6 acres in section 2. Doesn't in any way modify the 5% maximum lot coverage referenced in number 1, which refers to the CRC zoning requirement, which applies to the percentage of an individual lot. It just isn't hanging for me logically. That's how I read it.
If I could, Mr. Chair, just to add a little bit. I mean, as staff, we certainly looked through all of the prior, at least the staff memo that was prepared, at the time that this was approved, trying to understand what the applicant's application said and how, staff understood it. Mr. Patterson read through those documents as well. I don't recall the 1.6 acres ever being used as a reference related to lot coverage. There certainly was a lot of references to building envelopes, not anything explicit stating that's what should be used or allowed. But there's a lot of discussion about building envelopes and how they looked on each site, and looking at taking all of that together. My other thought, and just, this question, I guess, some of these lots also, are larger than 1.6. And so would they be subject to less than 5% lot coverage? If you were saying, well, you went the other way with it, I'm just thinking about it from a administrative standpoint. And then, would you essentially be, is the thought that we would take, for example, 0.43 acres, and divide that into 1.6 and then multiply the lot coverage, and that would be what they were allowed to have? I'm just trying to understand the intent. Right. Is a reason for my question. I'm not saying that you're wrong or incorrect in your view and how to administer this. I'm just asking kind of those questions.
Mr. Chair, if I may point out something, this may help any of us on this commission. Under the general notes, under point 1, zoning requirements of the CRC, which is what you're referencing. First item, minimum lot area, 2 acres. Under point 2, proposed PUD, average lot area 1.6 acres. So I don't see how possibly any of these parcels, I'll call them interior parcels, could be developed if the required minimum lot area was 2 acres. And I can't imagine that either the city council, the planning commission at the time, which recommended the city council at the time, and the developer agreed to a PUD, which would allow none of these lots to be developed, because it says the minimum, if you are going to, I won't say cherry pick, but if you're going to pick and choose which part of these general notes apply and which don't to any particular parcel, how can you not say the minimum lot area has to be 2 acres? And if it is 2 acres, then none of these interior lots should have been developed, because I don't think any of them are 2 acres. So obviously, when you look at the map, which is part of the resolution, which is part of the PUD, where these were designated lots, they are not 2 acres. They were designed to be lot size of 5% if you consider the average lot size of 1.6. So, I mean, in my mind, you have to look to see whether this was something that was intended to go forward, or it was intended to be futile and dead on arrival. And I can't imagine that they spent all this time putting a PUD together with the idea of, oh, none of these lots should be developed because under point 1 under the general zoning requirements.
Then why wouldn't you stipulate the size of the footprint instead of the 1.6 is, I mean, why not just say, factoring in the smallest lot being slightly smaller than 0.43, why wouldn't you figure out the size of that house that would be acceptable and kind of start from there. I mean,
We weren't part of the commission back in 2014, and that's what I don't understand.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, except I go to the diagram of the PUD, and not only does it have the lot sizes, but it has proposed approximate building sizes for the residences in the PUD. I'm sorry, for each lot in the PUD. So, you know, they're not wed to that, of course, no developer is. I mean, I'm no property owner. But I mean, there are, and what's interesting is, for example, in lot 19, the very place on this diagram where they show the residence and a shared driveway is exactly the place where this residence, proposed residence, is delineated with stakes. And I think you look at lot 20, the house is the same place in lot 20. I would say lot 21. You know, I mean, to say, oh, well, you know, it's got to be this under 0.1, but it can't be that under 0.2 of the general notes. I have a difficulty.
I think just to clarify, I don't disagree that the PUD asked for flexibility when it came to the size, the lot size, but 0.1 talks about the 5% lot coverage, and 0.2 doesn't, is silent on it, whereas it's not silent on the size, as is the map. The map also has the size, so it's the 5%, not the lot size, that I think is not clearly carried over as a variance of the beauty.
Well, 0.2 is silent on minimum lot area.
Correct. And then the one that they did designate was the difference in the height between the two. We do have a motion on the floor. Is there anyone that would like to call discussion complete?
So this, I didn't completely follow. Okay, so there's Mr. Lachey's motion that was placed on the floor. He was all of the recommended conditions in the staff report except for item number 1. And then Mr. Gardner, you had an amendment of some sort.
I amended to note that condition that it's compliant with the 1.6 acre average lot area as is referenced in the general notes that's on the actual PUD itself, as opposed to the zoning for the CRC district is 5% coverage, minimum lot area, 2 acres. So that aside, the overlay itself will allow 5% and then using an average of 1.6 acres. Does that make sense?
Not entirely following them, but
I'm in agreement with the motion that if you use the 1.6 acres that's in the general notes, this property is at about 5.1% of the square footage as proposed of 3,584 is 5.1% of a 1.6 acre average lot size. It's well in excess if you use the 0.43, which is the actual lot size itself. But if you use the average lot size that's being used within the PUD, it's 5.1%. So it's right at it's compliant with that.
And Mr. Gardner, or Commissioner Gardner, does
that make sense?
For the zoning administrator, I'm sorry?
Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me because I believe you're preserving the record and establishing as we go forward with potentially other lots that come before us, such as number 18, that we have expressly put into the record as to the basis for our decision tonight, one way or the other, so that we don't come into the same situation as we're facing now with the first lot that was developed and came before the planning commission, and everybody kind of does a collective, throws up their hands and says, gosh, I don't know how they decided this because there's no record. So I appreciate the friendly amendment.
Close discussion.
So you're agreeing to that amendment to the.
Yes, he did.
To your motion and Mr. Badgerak. Yes. Okay. So you, okay.
Want to read that back, Ryan? Please.
My understanding is that there's a motion to approve the plans as presented with the following conditions: that the applicant update the building plan to comply with the PUD height requirements, which would be measured from the lowest fire department vehicle access up to the eve of a pitched roof. Provide a landscaping plan in accordance with section 154027 and site restoration per resolution number 150610-A. Secure fire department approval of access and sprinkling system, secure Eagle critical dune permitting requirements as applicable. And then sixth, condition.
I believe there's only 5 conditions. Number 1 is the compliance with 5% lot coverage requirement as measured against the 1.6 average lot size within the PUD as referenced in the general notes on the approved PUD.
And that's what I agreed to.
The friendly amendment. And that,
I think that's pretty
and
clear.
then in the proposal, you did have that we're approving it with the administrative authority to
be confirmed administratively.
To be confirmed administratively that these 5 conditions are met.
I just want to make sure I understand about the building height. You had mentioned earlier that it could be 30 feet from the fire truck vehicle access or potentially the average grade at 28 feet. Is that correct?
That's historically the measure that was utilized. The PUD technically has the 30 foot, but historically, way I understand it is that they had allowed through what they were calling, minor variance between the CRC and the PUD.
The only reason I ask is that if there is any, I said, we're willing to change something to get this through. It would be significantly less destructive to meet that 28 average than the 30-foot vehicle access at this point. So if that is an option to consider, that is definitely something that we'd like to have a conversation about if that's possible.
And I believe that's what we're putting in by having it being administratively approved. It is something that it would allow for Ryan, to be able to work with you on the approval of the height.
Yeah, so you're not beholden to our schedule as a planning commission to work that out with the zoning administrator, the consultant, and the attorney if needed.
Because I think that is how it was approached on lot number 20, was that they took a look at both.
Well, Mr. Chair, the way I understand the motion, I mean, the language that was read was that they would update the building plan to comply with the PUD height requirement, and that we would administer it based on the language that's in the PUD, unless you advise a condition otherwise.
Yeah, I don't think we have the authority to change that. I think that the way this was written, as Mr. Lachey has made his motion, is update the building plan to comply with PUD height requirements, and there's a number of different ways to accomplish that.
Correct. Because that is the general notes relates to the entire PUD.
Yeah. Right.
So the 28 foot that's in the CRC zoning or the 30 foot that's in the PUD is both within the rights of the administrator as well as the planning commission. And we would say bring it back to the planning commission, but then you would have to be on our monthly schedule of, so our next meeting wouldn't be till the 3rd Thursday of January. So I would think that having it administratively approved would be beneficial.
Okay, if that's something we can work on together, I guess what I would worry about is, Ryan, if you disagree with that in some kind of way, and then we are not able to resolve that 28-foot average, does it go back to the planning commission for you guys to consider then at that point?
And I'm hearing different things, I feel like, from each of you. Okay, I'm hearing from Mr. Gardner that it's the PUD language that's there, and I hear from Mr. Mans that he sees that there's an average, the regular zoning ordinance average height calculation that can be applied here. And I want to make sure that everybody's.
If the average is applied, then it's a 28-foot limit, just like it would be within the CRC.
Right. The motion that's on the table states update the building plan to comply with the PUD height requirement.
Correct.
So if you intend something other than the language that's on the PUD height requirement, or believe that there's something else that we can administer here. I mean,
General Note 1 does list the 28 feet, correct?
It does.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you meet the general note of item 1 for height, does that not meet what our amendment clarification is, Ryan?
The way that I'm reading this is that the actual zone itself, the CRC zone, maximum building height is 28 feet, and that's pretty consistent across most of our districts in town. The PUD overlay district says we are proposing revised building height restrictions agreed to the fire chief and et cetera, et cetera. No building shall have a building height exceeding 30 feet as measured from the highest level fire department vehicle access in the eave of the pitched roof. Of course, this is a flat roof, so it's a bit, the PUD didn't really quite speak to that, but there are ways to be able to accomplish that. In my understanding, I'm not an architect, I'm not a designer, but there's ways that you can actually probably build a pad up or do some other things to maintain that 30-foot, perhaps lower the interior ceilings to get the building in compliance.
But let me.
And that's not our decision.
Right, but is your opinion that item 1 doesn't apply then? The 28 feet does not apply?
Well,
it's on the PUD drawing?
The way that I read this is that the proposed, well, at this point it was proposed, but it's now official, is that the PUD has a height restriction of 30 feet as opposed to 28.
Even with the general note number 1 saying 28 feet.
Yeah, because that's the actual zoning district and the PUD is an overlay to that. So in essence, the PUD itself, if I'm understanding this correctly, represents a bit of a different measurement.
Right.
Because it's an overlay district.
I read it the same way actually as you, Russ. That's how I've been thinking about it. One restates what's in the code. And then below it, they go on to modify some of those points, such as the height requirement.
Right, and the average lot area.
Right, that makes sense to me. So it's PUD.
And when I was pointing out, I was just pointing out that in the past, they have utilized both. So as far as prior precedent, but then that can also fall into the, when you're administering it, as the administrator or as the planning commission, you have the ability to approve it with those, if that would be considered a minor change between the way the calculation is done. But if we want to leave it as the PUD as it's written currently, then the answer would be we'd have to come up with a 30-foot, whether it be from another location on the lot that you could have a fire truck access. Is that how everyone is interpreting it? Needs to be the 30-foot PUD?
I think that also makes it easier for our zoning. I think one thing coming into this is it feels like there hasn't been a lot of documented clarity that's easy for people to, access and follow. And the more we can be really specific about what the direction is, what we're referring to, I think it helps future people. And I think it also helps our zoning administrator know exactly what it is we were saying.
Okay, and Mr. Chair, all right, we asked Mr. Patterson, Mr. Patterson, if you follow the discussion and essentially your thoughts on either they would meet the average, the normal zoning ordinance height requirement. So we would take it from average grade, and in the case of a flat roof to the top, and they could only go up to 28 feet, or they wanted higher than 28 feet. We would use the PUD language and say from the lowest fire department vehicle access up to 30 feet.
And Chris, you're on mute. There you go.
Yeah, I read it as has been sort of discussed by Russ and Ann. When you have sort of the zoning requirements in the CRC putting forth the minimum specifications, that's sort of what was required, and it's an underlying district. When you adopt a PUD, that is a PUD overlay that comes in as an ordinance amendment that then imposes those requirements. So I do agree with sort of the latter requirements. And I do believe that's also consistent with your supplemental memo related to the height approvals that occurred after the PUD was approved, but for maybe one of the projects, which I think consistent with this proposed project has a flat roof and is a few inches over note 2.
Correct. And then in that situation, they got the fire department's sign off similar to what you currently have, Joe, and with this existing project.
And I would go back to, and we had our discussion last week, the memo that was prepared for the planning commission, and which we have in front of us again tonight, is that understanding that the driveway elevation at the garage is the same as the garage slab, the height between the highest level of fire department vehicle access and the top of the parapet, which is the measurement for the flat roof, is 34 feet, 3 inches, which exceeds the PUD requirement by 4 feet, 3 inches. And I think we had agreement last week that there was not a discussion regarding the fact of the matter is that it was 4 feet and 3 inches above that. So then it goes on to say, while the fire department may have the current ability to respond to emergencies, the referenced height requirement is a zoning requirement through PUD adoption, which is what we've been talking about. A PUD amendment would be necessary to exceed that 30-foot limitation. That's how I'm interpreting it.
I agree. So I think the way that it's written with it being the PUD height requirement would be what we would have to meet.
Yeah.
The one thing that, there was, I said, Ryan was very helpful. He sent me the documents to also look through. I was obviously more familiar with 389 Dune Grass because I said I had worked for the firm that designed that. So I was familiar with that. I had the drawing set prior to that, so I was able to do an analysis. That dimension is 35 feet. That was a clear precedent. There's still one that's a little grayer to me. Even as an architect interpreting how it would be read through this code, because this mentions a very specific datum, but it does not reference the extent of that datum. Is it a point within that roof line? Is it the entire elevation? And the reason I bring that up is because the lot next door that utilizes a butterfly roof has a very small portion of that eave meeting the 30-foot requirement. And then as it extends out, it continues to be in violation of that. But since there was one point down at that 30-foot mark, essentially it was approved and is conforming. So in my eyes, not that I'm looking for ways to skirt around this, but if we just put a little notch in this thing to get it down to 30 feet at one spot, technically that's in conformance based on some of the other projects in the development. So I guess what I'm saying is that as a licensed architect, I am not able to interpret this, and which is the reason why I had originally consulted with the city to help me sift through this and understand how it's been applied and how to read this. Even in this discussion, I'm still not 100% sure how to apply it because it doesn't talk about the entire elevation, the extent of it. Is it a 30-foot section that's perfectly above the door, centered above the door, 5 feet? There's not enough information here to help inform how we would have to change the design to meet that standard.
I will agree. I think that's one of the challenges that we've all kind of faced is that we have this 30-foot limit. It does appear that in the past with the, first one that came before the planning commission didn't have a height issue. The ones that, had, or the one where like even the one that met, but it has the butterfly type of a roof, had an administrative approval, utilizing the flexibility. So, and that's where, if you have the 30-foot, I'm assuming I wasn't there and it wasn't part of the approvals, but there was a place where they were able to measure it, say that it was there or very close. And therefore, along with the fire department, the way that I understand the previous ones, was able then to say, you have met this requirement. And so, and if we are able to pass the motion this evening, and you are able to supply to Ryan the compliance with the items that are subject to our approval, then you'll be able to move forward and he'll have that same type of subjective approach.
Mr. Chair, a couple of thoughts real quick. One, if you think about in reverse, front yard setback, side yard setback, rear yard setback. Let's say it's 20 feet front yard setback. You only have to have one point that is 20.
Mm-hmm.
The others can be 30, 25, whatever. So with that in mind, you look under our zoning ordinance under the definition of height, the vertical distance measured from the average grade to the highest point of flat roofs. So whatever the highest point of that flat roof is, it's not the average of the highest points. It's not, you can't have an average of highest. It's not the average of the flat roof height. It is the highest point of flat roofs as I read height parentheses, building or structure, and parentheses, under the definition section of our zoning ordinance. So you get something that's the highest point of that flat roof, or I'll read it further, highest point of flat roofs to the deck line of mansard roofs and the average height between the eaves and ridge of a gable, hip, or gambrel roofs. There's your, I believe, the answer to your question.
So you're saying that you would average those heights to determine the PUD requirement, though, as far as the 30-foot datum? That's the part, and that's the part that I'm still a little confused.
So I would look back to the memo and the planning consultant and the zoning administrator on page 3, height. The height requirement was based, again, just to back up, the applicant has proposed a flat roof, which was not contemplated in the PUD plan.
Correct.
The height requirement was based on section D105.1 of the International Fire Code IFC, which states that the roof measurements are taken at the quote unquote top of parapet walls. So the section that Commissioner Lachey read completely makes sense to me. This is how it's being defined from a measurement standpoint, as the IFC is being used as the measurement at the top of the parapet walls, period. So if you were to, again, I'm not an architect, but if you were to cut a spot in that parapet wall, it still gets to the top of the parapet wall, the highest point. And I think, at least from my perspective as a commissioner, what we're trying to get to is a point at which we can get something that you can work with the zoning administrator and whoever else he needs to bring in and work through this administratively. Correct. As opposed to having to come back to the planning commission and having, I'm clearly not an architect or an engineer to try to help you. I'm just going by what we've been given from our experts in terms of what that measurement is going to be.
I guess the reason why I'm continuing this on is because at this point in the project where we're at through construction documents, what seemingly might seem like a minimal change at this point has quite a bit of effect throughout the project, both structurally, windows, fenestration. As you track that around, it becomes a significant amount of work. And for us to reference 2 projects within the PUD that are doing exactly what we're suggesting to do and have been told to do, I just want to make sure that there's latitude in there that, you know, we're not undoing the entire project to make this work and losing another 6 months and a ton of money between professional fees and structural engineering fees and potentially even Eagle revision fees through that, because this is stuff that they do care about as well. So that's why I said the mention of potentially meeting the 28-foot average, if that is what has been historically applied to, say, the 2 lots that are in non-conformance, that is something that we would want to take advantage of if at all possible.
It seems to me that the majority of the commission is and as the motion has been read, it is the PUD height requirement of 30 feet. The other thing I want to mention is I live in an Italianate house built in the late 1800s. They often had a widow's perch built on top, a cupola. I would suggest that some addition to the height of the house of some nature. I'm no attorney. I'm not a zoning administrator, but I think some creativity in terms of what the highest point on a flat roof might consist of is certainly something for you to consider. And that doesn't mean that you have to increase the windows all the way around or decrease the 10-foot roofs to 9, ceilings to 9 feet or 8 feet or whatever. So
I said it, and this might be a conversation for Ryan and I to have later. But you know,
no, if you are going to walk away from here and think that you have the option of 28 feet, I don't believe that is the consensus of this commission, and I don't believe that is the motion that we would be voting on.
Understood.
Good. Because you've brought that up now 3 or 4 times.
Well, I
understand you want to be clear.
Yep.
But I want to be clear right back at you.
Understood. No, and I wanted to just make sure that was the case.
And I understand your unclarity because we really did waffle on it earlier. But I think the motion now is clear on saying that the building plan must comply with the PUD height requirement. The height requirement in the PUD is 30 feet. And I believe that's the motion. I think that's the motion we're going to be voting on.
Yes.
And
I'm sorry, I'm not clear. What I seem to understand was that either meets the zoning district height requirement definition that's in our zoning ordinance, or which would go up 28 feet, or well, it's 30 feet, it has to use the language that's and how it's measured in the PUD. That's what, but I'm hearing something different from Mr. Lachey. So I want to make sure everybody is absolutely crystal clear, you know, coming out.
If the consensus of the commission is that it must meet the PUD, then that would be the 30-foot.
But the PUD has language in how that 30 foot is measured.
Right.
So there's a reference to the zoning ordinance that says, okay, we have a 28-foot height limit, and the zoning ordinance has a specific definition on how that's measured. And also the PUD then has a 30-foot height requirement, how that would be measured.
Yeah, and again, I would go back to what's in the packet and from the planning consultant and yourself, that flat roof is measured from the top of the parapet wall, period. And that is not fleshed out in the general notes in the PUD, because as it said in the note, it wasn't considered in the PUD. So it's outside of the.
Mr. Lachey, you made this quite clear of where you're standing with this on the motion.
Thank you.
My last question about this, though, is there any factor to consider with the existing buildings within Dune Grass, at least specifically with the one that currently is breaking this? Is this more just kind of, you know, they got through, they broke it, you know, shame on them. We got caught doing this and we must change it now, pretty late in the game, even though it's in opposition of what we were originally guided through. Is that basically the stance? If it is, I understand that, but I just want to make that clear.
it strikes me, and when you say the one that got through, you're talking about
389.
lot 20.
Lot 20.
Yep.
Okay. My understanding with respect to lot 20 is that they are compliant because they built an additional driveway, landing pad, piece of concrete, whatever it is. So they are compliant.
I provided supplemental drawings for that project to show where the extent of the fire access is and why that driveway is non-compliant. It's too big, too long, and too skinny. It does not meet the fire code. The fire access is actually at the front yard, and it's clearly identified on the site plan. It's clearly identified as what was approved, and there's a specific dimension from that datum.
Yeah, and the architect's correct in that. It does not, that home does not meet the PUD height requirement, but if you were to use the zoning ordinance height measurement of average grade and go up to 28 feet, it is under 28 foot. So it meets the zoning ordinance.
I guess, you know, having been an attorney for 40 some years, 1 of 7 isn't the same as 4 of 7, 5 of 7, 7 of 7. 1 of 7 is, you know, it happened. And to then put on the second part of your comment that because you're doing it right, that somehow you're being penalized because somebody else got through. That in my mind would have more weight if 5 of 7 got through, but when 1 of 7 got through and it's like a foot, that doesn't.
It's 5 feet, but I understand.
Okay, I thought it was 31 point something feet.
No, this is the second one that was in question. That
I'm working from memory.
The one that I'm referencing is lot 20. That's not this image here. This is lot 17.
I know. I'm not looking at this. I'm just looking generally.
Okay. I'm making the claim that 2 of the 7 are non-compliant. That's what I was trying to do with this diagram here.
I think the motion, and I apologize for the confusion to the applicant's architect and to our zoning administrator. If we are, I think, to approve the site plan, I believe that we have the condition that it meets the PUD height requirement, which is 30 feet. That is the motion that I am now making. Is that the motion?
I will
you're
still
seconding?
second it, yes.
That is what's in the existing motion.
Is that now clear to you, sir? 30 feet.
30 feet will be applied per the note that's in the PUD. And that's how it will be determined. I mean, that's what's being referenced as the PUD height requirement. It just provides a measurement on how to measure that. I just want to make sure that if you believe that 30 feet can be measured in a different way, that needs to be clear, I think, in your motion.
Well, I believe that
I have no freaking clue how to measure 30 feet other than what it is said here and what the general practice of zoning administration and architects and construction.
Correct.
And I am not an expert in any of those.
Because I think it comes down, I'm just trying to think of the situation, and is there a place where they're able to have a fire truck where it would be within 30 feet of the height?
Yeah, certainly. We'll evaluate
the
language that's in the PUD and how to measure height, just as we've
It
presented.
doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be from, the drive, just like it was on the neighboring one. So I think it gives you the flexibility for the administrator and for you, just like it would be if you're coming back in front of us with a revision. The difference is you wouldn't have to come back in front of us. You would have the approval, assuming that it is agreeable with the administrator and is in line with the PUD in calculating the 30 foot.
And Ryan, I believe this is a term of art. The definition of height, again, in our zoning ordinance is the vertical distance measured from the average grade. And I assume average grade is a term of art that can be applied by you, by an architect, by anybody who can look at an architectural drawing and figure out what the average grade is. Is that correct?
Average grade is defined in our zoning ordinance and how to calculate that. I mean, but that's not what we're going to use to measure 30 feet, because that's not the language that's in the PUD.
It's wherever the landing is.
We're clear that the way we measure what the PUD requires is how the PUD measures. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Got it.
So the motion is for the approval with the 5 conditions that the city administrator, the city plan administrator has the ability to approve.
That the 5% lot coverage will be based on a 1.6 acre.
That's how we.
I think I understand where we're at.
Motion to close discussion.
You don't need that.
Just call for the roll call.
I want to call for the vote. I'm sorry.
Just take a vote, Mr. Chair.
I'd like to call the vote, and if we could do a roll call for it, please.
Okay. Azarek?
Yes.
Excuse me, it should be the mover and seconder should be the first people voting under Robert's rules.
Sorry. It actually should be. Okay.
I've never heard of that. I've been on a number of boards and voted first, last, depending, and it hasn't mattered, but I'm happy to use. I was going to go either way and then leave the chair last.
Let's go with tradition.
All right. Broker?
No.
Shea?
Yes.
Gardner?
Yes.
Anderson?
No.
And Chair Mans?
Yes.
All right, motion passes 4-2.
Great. Moving on, item 2, underneath new business was public hearing signage. Ryan, I believe you have a discussion as well as examples.
I'm going to move a sample up closer to you here. Seeing is believing, so sometimes. All right. So my understanding is that the Planning Commission previously has looked at some extra ways to notify the community of various happenings. One of the suggestions that the Planning Commission had was to look into placing signage outside of properties that are subject to an upcoming public hearing. So staff kind of took a look at some different options that are out there, and also kind of ironically found some things that we already have in place. In front of you is a sign, an A-frame sign that's really sturdy that our city clerk uses for election day. There's 3 of these. And I've talked with our city staff about the ability to basically create new signage. They're kind of on S-hooks that could be swapped out. So I wanted to bring this forward to you to take a look at this evening. Essentially, the signage would be very simple and say, this property is subject to an upcoming public hearing. For more information, contact the zoning administrator or see the city websites. So would not take the place of any legal requirements related to the paper or sending out notices per the Zoning Enabling Act. We still would push everything out through, email and put it on our city website. This would be just an extra measure. Thing I liked about the A-frame sign, I mean, these things are, as you probably heard, quite sturdy. I think they can withstand pretty challenging weather conditions. I also like the fact that they're not, you don't have to put anything into the ground. I don't want to hit sprinkler lines or any of those types of things on somebody's property. So they're a little heavy and bulky, but I think that they would stand up. And so I wanted to get the Planning Commission's feedback tonight on whether you like it or not before we kind of pull the trigger on the purchase. So just a discussion item.
I'll take the lead since I think I brought this to the table in the first place. And there's a 300-foot requirement around a property that's subject to a zoning approval or a public hearing that everybody within that 300-foot radius receives a letter. So, but I also know is that there's a lot of, they call them looky-loos or whatever they call them around the country, but people that want to become familiar with what's going on in the community. And my idea was to, and I've seen it in other communities, large and small, is to put some type of sign out at the property just to let people know that there's something coming up in regards to zoning, or whether it's a ZBA or planning commission public hearing. So that's kind of where the idea came from. I didn't want to make this administratively difficult for the staff has enough to do without worrying about something like this, but something that was fairly easy to accomplish. And I think increase the transparency and communication to our community. That's really what that's what's driving this.
And I agreed. I think that if you had some type of signage that would allow for when people walk by, they could see that this is going to be discussed at a zoning meeting on X date, or a planning commission meeting, or a public hearing. So, we had talked about whether it be some kind of a placard, like you've seen, but I do agree when it comes to, putting stuff in people's yards, and digging it in, this could be a viable option. And so if we could have something like this, it's got a, just an open slot that you can actually put, a document in that would be waterproof, or as, I don't know how you're planning on putting the notification in. Would it just be like in a plastic?
It wasn't, I did see some examples that do have that option. I was planning on something more general. I kind of included kind of a sample in your packet just to kind of say that this property is subject to a zoning hearing, and then putting the burden on that person to contact the zoning administrator or, see our city website for further detail. With these signs, we wouldn't be able to change out, the meeting dates or anything like that, or the particular board, but at least let's, another point too, the thought is that these would be placed essentially on the public property outside of the property. Certainly if an applicant was okay with it being placed on their property, we, wouldn't have a problem doing that, but I don't, ideally, I think we were just looking at, okay, where's the public property at outside, and that it's on city land essentially, and we're just kind of notifying the community that way.
Right, just suggestion to throw the QR code on it, save you a bunch of phone calls. They can go right to the
website. That's a fair idea. Yeah, could put the city website QR code or something. Yeah, I like that idea.
Good idea.
Yeah.
From my perspective, we can give it a shot. We can make adjustments if we find that certain things are not working. I love the QR code. Thank you, CJ. That's a great suggestion.
The QR code's a great idea, and the signage being
find the date. They can find all that stuff right there.
Portable.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's the same all the time. It wouldn't be changeable.
Yeah. The only thing I would suggest, though, is that the city staff come back with a recommendation on some of the parameters around this as to when it will be placed, when it will be removed, just so the property that's subject to this would understand that that sign's going to be there from this time to this time.
Right. once the meeting has occurred or the hearing
Right,
has occurred.
right. Because it does require some city staff to have to manage that, just trying to make
That's
this
true.
as non-obtrusive as possible,
Mhm.
but also so there's clear parameters for the property owner. I think it's worth a shot, just to see how it works.
Is it consistent? Again, it's a discussion item, so it does not require any motion.
Yeah.
Thank you. We're all in favor of it. Okay.
I do have a hesitancy. And if it were a motion, I probably wouldn't vote no based on this hesitancy, but you know, the 300 feet are the people who are the property owners who are most directly impacted by the zoning variance request.
Okay.
If somebody lives 5 blocks away and happens to walk the dog by, you know, I'm not sure that they may have an interest, a general interest, but I'm not sure they have the interest of somebody who, for example, the property we were looking up out on Spear, the 300 feet, those people absolutely came forward and had input and impact. You answered my question that would go on the city right away instead of the private property. That takes away the potential for someone to say, no, I don't want it on my private property, but you can't tell me I can't go ahead with a zoning appeal, for example. And I assume you mean one sign. You said we've got 3. You said one sign. Is that what you're anticipating?
We would have 3 of these signs made, or up to 3 available.
So on a particular parcel that would be on a zoning appeal, you're going to put 3 of these?
No, there'd only be one. We're saying, what if we had 3
No, I'm just
different?
asking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you would not have 3. I wouldn't support having 3 signs on the property.
No. I think
It'd only be one.
it's just, yeah, say we have 3, if we had 3 public hearings, each of those particular properties, yeah.
I mean, the likelihood we'd ever utilize all 3 is pretty small, but.
And to Commissioner LaShaye's comment about the people within the 300 feet, I mean, that's in the zoning ordinance and that's not changing.
Correct.
It's those 300 feet radius. Those are the people that would be most impacted by most of these projects. But I also know as a community that people want more transparency. Oh, I didn't know there's a discussion about that property. They may not have a opinion about it, but just to increase it with relatively low cost, being able to notify people of it. And it's routinely done in a number of communities. So.
Good enough.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Very good. Last time on new business, the short-term rental discussion to build a tentative schedule, calendar planning and objective. Again, let me note for all those who have remained online and thank all of you as you've endured tonight's meeting. And as we said in the opening, the reason why this is being discussed is that was the number one thing on the community survey that was sent out at the end of the year when they asked what we should be addressed or reviewed within the city of Saugatuck was short-term rental. And the city council, has, along with the planning commission, has discussed the possibility of taking a look at this and then in full transparency, making certain that we have it on the agenda and discussion. What we really were proposing tonight is to kind of set, again, the framework for how this may occur as we move forward, not knowing what will occur by the end of the process. What I was at least contemplating, and then I'm going to open it up and see what others are thinking, would be that we would try to schedule this to where by January's planning commission meeting, we would ask the city administrators to provide us with the data related to where the number of short-term rentals that we have currently, where they are located, within what zones. And then if we could ascertain where was this number, what was the number 5 years ago or 3 years ago, so we can kind of see how it's growing. Also, I think it's important for us as planning commissioners and as we are looking at the data to try to also assess what is the issue that may be coming from, the community. And some of this we may not know until you move forward into the discussions, but is it because of noise? Is it because of garbage? Is it because of loss of community within a neighborhood? All of these may be, items, and this is something that will also need to be addressed. But I think as the planning commission, within that January meeting, once we have some of the data, we would want to kind of formulate what we think is driving it. The idea that I would foresee would be after we would have the data provided to us, and also in addition to the data would come from the city commissioner, we do understand that there are companies and organizations out there that help municipalities track the number of vacation rentals within their community. I know that myself and I think Bobby, I believe CJ, we were all on a conference call, a Zoom video recently. Holly, you were on with it was just one company that actually provides this, and they have followed up and agreed that they would do a complete scan using all of their capabilities, which if you look at over 90 different vacation rental sites to tell us how many properties we've had within the city of Saugatuck. And they've also agreed to do it for the Saugatuck Township and the Douglas Village in case they would want to join in on these type of discussions if they're going to be moving forward. So I would like to have that data that we can kind of compare to our own licenses that are in existence today. Between the January and February meeting, I think that we would be imperative that we, as a commission, would start to talk about the next steps if we were moving forward, which would be forming a task force and making certain that we put some parameters around the task force as to how many people we would want to have on the task force, knowing that the task force would be necessary to have members of the Planning Commission, members of City Council, as well as the various different viewpoints that we can anticipate from the community itself. Those that are maybe short-term, who own short-term rental properties, the businesses that are in, business owners of B&Bs, hotels, restaurants, as well as members of the individual community. All of that would have to be considered for putting together and having them participate in a task force. Once a task force is developed, I think the task force then would kind of get together and would set a schedule as to how they would try to proceed. This is what's occurred in other communities. And whether you call it a task force or an ad hoc type of committee. The task force then would determine, are we going to handle it initially by doing a survey, which would kind of help assess, what the community, what is the real issues in the community. Then, would they have public hearings, community meetings, roundtables? That would all be something that would be discussions amongst the task force members. But I'd like to propose, or at least discuss, that if the task force is formed after our February meeting, that they are identified and would possibly have their first meeting report back to us by our March meeting. And these are just frameworks. This is just kind of a guideline as to how we might be able to see it proceed. And then each month, the task force would actually report to the Planning Commission, and then we would evaluate, and then the Planning Commission then could report back to City Council with the goal that by the May, we should have an opportunity to at least have conducted through the task force surveys and or community type of meetings with a goal of by the early summer meetings, hopefully of having some type of information that would allow us to make a decision of, do we really at this point want to start to evaluate what other communities have done, and how would we want to put any type of ordinance in place that would be in accordance with state as well as local laws.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Mann. I would also just add that as a city council member and as a member of the community, I hear about short-term rentals from a lot of people. And the thing is that there's never really a real, when you ask about short-term rentals, the only comment I really get is there's just seems to have been I know what word to use, but there's just been a great growth in those in the community, and there's having an impact on people in different ways. And from my perspective, I don't know what the solution looks like. I think, as you suggested, I think that's got to come from stakeholders as well as the community in terms of, is it a problem? What exactly is the problem? And that's yet to be defined. Mm-hmm. So to your point, what I would wholly support is that we ask city staff to put together, and I love to be this as visual as we can make it. So anybody can look and see, okay, you look at all the zoning districts that we have, where the properties are that are currently licensed as short-term rentals. I've heard there's up to 240 of them as a number I've heard. I don't know how accurate that is, but that's part of the issue, is that we don't even know where we are data-wise at this point. Start from that and then begin to talk about, okay, what are the next steps to try to get a pulse from the community, all those that are involved, and take it where it goes. I mean, just I don't have a predisposed destination on this. I just get it started.
And I think that's, I agree with you, Russ. And point is, we get our own data, and then if we can get an outside source, like if we can say that we've got 240 licenses, but then an outside source can show us where 417, homes have actually, advertised for rental. That's just data points. And to anyone who owns short-term rentals, it does not mean that anyone's going to try to we have no intention of saying that these are going to be necessary changes. This is just a starting point of looking at the data. However, we do know that there are, concerns, within the community, but we do need to hear from everyone, because we are also very much aware, and I know from talking with every member here on the commission and every community that I know who's addressed this, they're very aware that this has multiple ramifications whenever you start looking at these type of ordinances, where everything from legal ownership down to, what effect does it have on communities, real estate pricing? Those will all be things that would have to be discussed within the task force and the community involvement. And that would be the number one thing that, as I would say, as the chair of the planning commission, I'm sure we'd all agree, is that we would want to have it transparent, and we want to make certain that it is a community, that you're getting all opinions, and that whatever comes back to the planning commission from a ad hoc committee or a task force is evaluated based upon all data. And then we'd move forward from that point. And it would not be something that will be done in the next 30 days or 60 days. This is the process, and we're just now starting the process.
Mr. Chair, I mean, data will be great, and not only what we think, what we know or think we know, but getting an outside perspective on that. I think also if there are opportunities, there are, different constituent groups or stakeholder groups in this who feel rightly so very strongly, and there are different points of views. If we can find forums or some ways to devote listening to different stakeholders, so we really hear them. And I mean, anyone can listen, but really, instead of getting into argument in every session and people trying to talk over, and if we can listen to what the owners of the short-term rentals think and have opportunities for them to really have an open ears and listen to them. And I don't know if this is practical, but it would be great, given that this is such a heated topic, if we can find ways so that each constituent group feels listened to, and we can really discern their issues, needs. And then if we, bring that together, great, but we start by listening before we debate.
So you're thinking whether it's the planning commission or the task force, that they would have a community meeting potentially of all those who they're own or in favor of,
right,
short-term rentals,
focus groups or surveys, but somehow really try to understand each voice sort of with an open mind and heart, so that people feel heard.
And I think that's one of the things that we would, after we get the data, the proposal, at least the framework that I'm suggesting would be by the February meeting, we would start to talk about who are the various groups that we would want to make certain we have a representative on the task force,
right?
And how many, so is it how many from the planning commission, how many from council, how many from short-term rental owners, how many business owners, that would kind of, because again, you don't want to have a task force that's 40 people. I mean, it's got to be, as you know, from other committees. But I think that we're not even there yet. We got to see the data first. But as if we did move forward, it would be forming that task force. And then I think letting the task force kind of develop their community approach, whether it's survey. I think it's probably going to be everything. My guess is, if I had to look at what other communities have done, many times you start with kind of an overall survey that, gives them more options, of things that have happened. But first kind of identify what is the real issue that we should be addressing. And then, might be even a second survey that would go out, or the community groups, much like you did, on the bike trail, or you've done on coastal, is kind of how I would, that's how I at least envision it proceeding, as opposed to it having to be always the planning commission, which again puts it down to, hey, it's only once a month that we have meetings. They could have meetings in between and then report back to us.
Yeah, and I completely agree with your comments, Commissioner Anderson. The good news here is that almost all of the lakeshore communities that are our neighbors are talking about this, and they're dealing with it in their own way. So there's a lot of different roadmaps that we can look at. I want a solution that's specific to the needs of city of Saugatuck
Absolutely.
and our residents and business owners and the short-term rental companies that do business here. Our solution may look different than Grand Haven, may look different than South Haven, may look different than New Buffalo, wherever you want to go. But there's many communities even outside of the state of Michigan that are dealing with this issue. And so anyway, there's a lot of roadmaps we can look at that's going to be appropriate for us, but the solution has to be specific to what's best for our city.
Yes, Chairman Gardner,
period.
Commissioner Gardner, I will definitely say that I agree with that, because one of the things that happens on a regular basis, and I'm sure we've all faced it, is when it does come up, somebody always has what in their opinion would be a solution. And they're providing a solution before we've even identified what is the issue or what is the problem. And so I think that our approach is trying to really make certain we identify it, knowing that there are going to be multitudes, if and when you decide that a solution is necessary, that there are multiple roads, as you're saying, of ways to try to accomplish it, but it has to be something that works for Saugatuck. And I think we've discussed this previously, if we are, all in favor of moving forward with creating some type of framework, I now want to try to reach out to Saugatuck Township and the village of Douglas to find out if they would like to participate and be part of the overall task force as a tri-community approach to this versus just the city of Saugatuck. And I would like to hear the feedback as to whether you think that is a positive idea or a negative idea.
Yeah, I can tell you from some informal conversations I've had with Township and the city of Douglas, yes, they're interested.
Yeah, that's
they're going to be watching, and I'm assuming we want to participate at some level. So, but our solution has to represent the city of Saugatuck first and foremost.
Okay.
Two thoughts, one, if I may, first to Commissioner Anderson's point, and I'm not sure this is what she was getting at when she was saying potentially focus groups. What we have traditionally done is an open public hearing, and every viewpoint stands up and says their viewpoint, and instead maybe have on a given night those people who are business owners show up.
Mm-hmm.
Those people who have Airbnbs show up.
Yep.
Those people who live next door to an Airbnb and can't stand the fact that they live next door to an Airbnb show up. So that, because I think if we do multiple public hearings, you're going to have the same people stand up every single night because they're so emphatic about their point. And it will get lost, also will get lost in, I'll say, the noise of the melange of yes, no, maybe over here, let's try this, whatever. So if I understood you correctly, maybe have focused public meetings. Correct. And just regulate it. If I stand up and I don't own a short-term rental or have a short-term rental, and I go to the short-term rental public hearing, I'm sorry, Mr. Lachey, this is not your public hearing. Yours is next Tuesday. Please sit down.
And again, I think that would be the task force, so I don't want to put too many rules out,
I'm throwing that idea out.
Absolutely.
The second idea is I'm not sure if I understood correctly that we would make it a tri-community task force. That seems unwieldy to me.
That was interrupt a little bit, but sorry, that's my concern, that it gets to get too big. The focus groups have different focuses as you start to move on.
Right. So, let's proceed with us. Okay. If Douglas and the city of the village of Douglas and the township want to watch what we do, good for them. But I think we need to, I think we need to proceed ourselves.
And again, I think after we have the data, that would be what we evaluate the data. And then I foresee that we would want to discuss in that January meeting, how do we proceed with a task force and what it would look like, with the goal of trying to have the framework around the task force by our February meeting.
Sounds good. Mr. Chair, do you want a motion in that regard, or is this a discussion topic?
I think it was discussed. I mean, that's what I was trying to remember. I think it's a discussion item, because I don't know if we have to really make a motion that we're going to create a framework, or.
I think staff has heard that you'd like some more data to be presented to you at your next meeting, to at least take a look at that and then kind of go from there on some further discussion on possible task.
I would assume in January we need a motion to form a task force. So that would be.
The other, piece that's to kind of consider, and some things that we'll have to look at from staff perspective is, for forming kind of a task force committee that would be, gathering data and also working on potential policy recommendations. I think we want to make sure that there's Open Meetings Act notices that are being made and minutes being taken, and some of those requirements are also, when we start getting into public hearings and limiting who can and can't speak, those are things that we would have to do some research on. Because typically you have to at least offer an opportunity for everybody to make their comments at some point during the meeting, but is my understanding, but it's certainly something that we could discuss with legal counsel and bring some thoughts back to you on.
Yeah, that might not be possible.
And I do think that it's, as we proceed, once we get the data, when we're looking at how we want to try to proceed, it may be advantageous to bring in, our planning consultant who has worked with other communities and kind of help give us some guidance as to, can the task force have community forums that are just forums versus a public hearing, which has to be publicly noticed? How does that work? Yes.
Yeah, I think staff can work on getting some of this data together for your next meeting and some other potential thoughts or recommendations. Yeah.
Perfect. Great.
It's fantastic. With that, communications, they were included in your packets. Report of officers or committees. Will we have any public comment at this time? Anybody who's in the public that would like to speak, they can speak to any topic. You would limit your comments to 3 minutes. And again, state your name and your address. Is there anyone in the room or online that would like to make a public comment?
All right, just a reminder for those that are online that haven't attended a meeting before, if you could just kind of raise your kind of virtual hand there on your device, and then can call upon you. Not seeing anybody online or in the room, Mr. Chair.
Having not seen anyone, we will close that section of public comment. At this time, do I have a motion to adjourn?
Second.
All those in favor?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Opposed? Meeting is adjourned. I will wish all of you a good evening and a very happy holiday. Happy New Year, and we will be talking to you and see you all in January.
Thank you.